The sun dips below the horizon and paints the Mediterranean in hues of burnt orange and blood red. The great city of Rome, a sprawling mass of marble and brick and flesh, stirs from its slumber and begins to dream. For it is night, and the hours before sleep are always the longest. It is then that men tell stories by the light of flickering candles or oil lamps. Tales of heroes and monsters and gods, stories of love and war and everything in between. And who better to tell such tales than Appian? He was born for it. He was trained for it. His life was literature. But tonight he sits alone in his study writing. Not on papyrus. No. Not for him, those cheap scrolls. No. He is shaping words on the finest vellum, a surface so smooth it almost seems to glow. And what words he is choosing? Words that will stir your heart and make your blood run cold. Words that will introduce you to a cast of characters more intriguing than any wax mask in the Forum. For our tale tonight concerns three of the most powerful men in all of Rome, three giants whose shadows stretch long across the empire, men whose deeds have shaken the foundations of the Republic and sent tremors through the very gates of hell. We have met them before. Two of them at least, Pompey and Caesar. They were rivals once, but now they stand shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. The third man is not so well known outside of Rome, yet his power is such that even the barbarians tremble at his name. He is Marcus Licinius Crassus, and he is the richest man in all of Rome. I know what you're thinking. You've read all about these men, haven't you? What more can possibly be said of them? Well, how about this? Let us go back to when these men were young and their lives had yet to be written. How about we see them through eyes that have never seen the glory of their deeds? And best of all, let us listen into their own words as they speak to us directly and reveal the secrets that lie beneath their iron wills. It sounds good, doesn't it? Well, then let's begin our tale. The tale of three Roman giants. Come, sit by the fire with us, and let Appian be your guide. He is ready. Are you? Very well then. Let us start. Where do you go when you want to forget your worries? When you need to escape the clamor of the crowds and the weight of the world pressing down upon your shoulders? You could take Appian's advice and visit one of Rome's many taverns or brothels. But if you prefer something a bit more refined, perhaps a stroll through the gardens would suit you. Oh, come, do not fear. You are among friends here. Haudu, ikeno, because I see by your troubled brow that you carry burdens aplenty. Why hide it? Here you are among men just like you, men who have known both triumph and despair, men who understand the burden of responsibility. Oh, I know that look. You think this place is but a playground for the idle rich. Huh, come now, I see right through you. You mistake luxury for idleness. Well then, allow me to prove myself right. Look around you. See those noble senators? They spend more time here than in the Senate. Those generals who have carved up the provinces among themselves. They come here to unwind after making plans that will change the face of the empire forever. Even the great Caesar himself, that lion of the north, he too finds solace among these trees. But enough of them. Tell me, friend, what brings you here tonight? Ah, you wish to hear a story. Very well. Let us begin. Let us start with a man named Pompey Magnus. Huh, do you know him? Of course you do. Who in Rome does not know Pompey? Yet I say to you that most know not half of his story. They remember the wars he fought and the honors he won. But what do they know of the man behind the legend? He was born into the twilight of the Roman Republic, you know, and his father was but a low cavalry officer. That is not how Rome was built, my friend. No, you did not win consulships, or legions, or victories with connections like that. Oh, you must earn your way. Pompey did, and he did it in style, too. He came to Rome a young man eager to carve out his niche in the world. Had fortune smiled on him? By Jupiter, it did not. He tried the law, but soon found it wanting. Politics. He tried that, too, but the backstabbing and intrigue disgusted him. So what was left? War, of course. That was where a young man could truly prove himself in battle against a worthy foe. And prove himself he did. First, there was that pirate in the Aegean, the one they called the Crown's Bane. Then it was Mithridates of Pontus, King of Kings. The East seethed with unrest, and Pompey was sent to put it down. Can you imagine their surprise when he marched back into Rome in triumph? For that campaign alone, he might have been acclaimed a hero. But Rome was hungry for more, and what followed was almost too much to bear. Rome's greatest general defeated king after king Metellus Sulla, the last of the Marians. His reputation grew with each victory until the whole world trembled at the mere mention of his name. There were some who thought it went to his head. They said his ambition knew no bounds. They watched him award himself laurels and titles. They saw how the Senate fawned over him, and they wondered, could this be the man who would end the Republic and bring the empire to its knees? Well, perhaps he could have. But you and I both know that was not his destiny. No. You want to know the real reason why Pompey succeeded where others failed? It was because he knew how to play the game of politics. Yes, you heard me right. While other generals thought only of battle and conquest, Pompey had his eye on Rome. He understood the levers of power and pulled them expertly to his advantage. He knew which senators to cozy up to and which to ignore. He knew which provinces were ripe for exploitation and which would drain the treasury. Most important of all, he knew when to strike and when to hold back. Some say it was all a carefully crafted plan. Others say it was sheer luck. But one thing is certain, none knew the art of statecraft better than Pompey. Do not look so shocked, my friend. It is true. Money makes the world go round. Without it, you are nothing. With it, you can move mountains. And who knows more about that than Marcus Licinius Crassus? Ah, there he is. See him, that imposing figure, striding purposefully towards the Senate, his purple toga billowing behind him like the sails of a ship. People turn heads as he passes, eager to catch a glimpse of the richest man in Rome. They whisper to one another, comparing notes on his latest exploit. You've heard of his wealth. Of course. Who hasn't? They say he owns more property in Rome than any other private citizen. His houses are the envy of kings, filled with priceless works of art and luxurious furnishings. His slaves work tirelessly to keep his chariots polished and his horses well fed. Even Caesar envies his wealth. Caesar, you say well, I'll not deny it. Crassus and Caesar were not the best of friends. In fact, there was more than a little jealousy between them. Caesar had the people, the army, and the provinces. Crassus had the money, the influence, and the patience. Patience, my friend, is a quality not often found in men of power, but it was Crassus's greatest strength. While others chased glory on the battlefield, he honed his skills in the markets and the forums of Rome. He bought vineyards and farms, houses and slaves, anything that could turn a profit. Some said he was a miser, but that was not the case. He simply knew the value of money and how to use it to his advantage. If someone wanted something, whether it was land, a slave, or political support, they went to. He was never stingy with his money, but he knew exactly how much to offer in order to get the most in return. He was the banker of Rome, and he played his role to perfection. They call him the richest man in Rome, but ask anyone who has ever done business with him, and they will tell you that is not his greatest title. They will tell you that he is the smartest. Now, as for how he made his fortune, that is a story for another night. But let me tell you this. If you want to know how to win at the game of power, you should watch him carefully. The first rays of dawn paint the sky in hues of rose and gold. Night has fallen once more on the eternal city, and with it, the sounds of revelry and laughter have faded away, leaving behind only the murmur of crickets and the distant call of a night bird. In the shadows of a crumbling archway, a lone figure emerges, his face half hidden by the deep hood of his cloak. He is tall and powerfully built, his muscles rippling beneath his rough-spun tunic. There is a sword at his hip and a spear over his shoulder. His face, though obscured, is handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His eyes, when they appear, gleam with intelligence and determination. He moves with the easy grace of a man who has spent his life in the saddle, his gaze fixed on the distance. As he walks, the sound of his sandals on the stone pavement echoes in the deserted street, the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Who is this man? Where is he going? And what troubles lie ahead? His name is Gaius Julius Caesar. Yes, that Caesar. Perhaps you've heard of him. I thought as much, but do not think for a moment that you know him. You've seen the monuments and read the histories, but I say there is more to the man than marble and myth. He was born into a family of old money. True, and his lineage could be traced back to the very founders of Rome. But he did not inherit his power. No, he earned it. He clawed his way up from obscurity to become the most feared man in Rome. What was it that drove him? Was it ambition or desperation? Could it be pride or the lust for power? Or was it something else entirely? There are those who say he craved the adulation of the masses. But I say he needed their support. If he wanted to succeed, he needed their votes. To win elections, he needed their approval. Without it, he was nothing. Others say it was the Senate that made him, that it was their support that propelled him to the heights of power. But I say, the Senate was merely a means to an end. He used them, but he never truly belonged to them. Still others say he was a soldier at heart, that his true calling was in the battlefield, not in the halls of government. But I say war was his last resort, not his first choice. He understood the value of peace, but he was willing to wage war to preserve it. Many books have been written about Caesar, many statues erected in his honor, but none have captured the essence of the man. None have delved into the depths of his mind, the labyrinth of his thoughts. So let me ask you this. What drives him? What makes him tick? And above all, what is his destiny? We have barely begun our tale, my friend, and already the shadows grow long. Soon the sun will set, and with it, the day will end. But do not fear. We have only reached the first chapter of our story, a story of ambition and betrayal, of love and loss, of glory and despair. The tale of 3 Roman giants, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, is about to begin. And you, dear listener, are about to be swept up in its currents. Come with me now on this journey through time, and let us relive the days when Rome was at its zenith, when the world was at its most tumultuous, and when the fates of empires were being decided. Stay with me until the very end, for I promise you, the ending will not disappoint. Hello everyone, and this is chapter 2 of our series covering the life of Gaius Pompeius Magnus. In our last episode, we discussed how Pompey was born in the year 106 BCE to a family of Roman equestrians who had moved from their native Picenum into the city of Rome. We also talked about the tumultuous times he was born into, with the Roman Republic locked in civil war between the 2 great factions of the Marians and the Sullans. But it's now time to turn our attention towards Pompey's early life, looking at what sort of environment he was raised in, the people who had the biggest influence on him, and how his childhood experiences may have helped plant the seeds of the military genius he would one day become. So if you can spare a few moments, sit down, relax, and let's get into it. Much like his parents before him, young Pompey grew up in the Italian countryside of Picenum, where his father Pompeius Strabo owned several estates. In fact, Strabo seems to have been quite well off, even by the standards of a Roman equestrian, since he was able to employ a staff of freedmen on his properties and could afford to send his sons to study in Rome. And it was there that Gaius received most of his education. The area around Asculum was a pleasant place to be stationed. It was warm but not too hot in the summer, and the winters were mild, though wet. There was good soil for farming. The local towns were lively and full of culture. And most importantly, it was relatively quiet, removed from the fighting that had broken out in other parts of Italy. But make no mistake, despite the relative peace and quiet, this was still a very dangerous assignment for a legionary and his family to take on. Strabo himself had previously been assigned to serve in Spain, which was still a very dangerous posting during this period, given that it was one of Rome's most militarized provinces, and was still being settled by Roman veterans. And while Strabo was in Spain, Rome was under the control of Sulla, whose regime was far from lenient with his enemies. So when he returned to Picenum, he likely did so, expecting some reprisal from the Marian party, since the Sulla feeling in the countryside would have been strong and he would have made powerful enemies. This may explain why Strabo decided to move his family back to Rome. After all, although Picenum was only a short journey away from us, where the bulk of his fortune was tied up, there would have been a lot of travel involved in administering his properties. And as an equestrian, Strabo would have needed to travel to Rome for business anyway. And there is evidence that at this point in his career, he hoped to secure a prestigious position as a military tribune. It doesn't appear that any of his sons were old enough at this point to join the military with him. But there is some indication that his eldest boy, Gnaeus Pompeius, might have been close enough to his father to accompany him on campaigns. He was certainly old enough to have been left in charge of the family estate and its operations, as Strabo would later name him as the administrator of his will. So he would have been at least into his late teens or even early adulthood by this point. So while the exact circumstances of young Pompey's upbringing remain unclear, it appears that he and his brothers were probably brought up on their family estates and they would have lived a comfortable life, typical of a wealthy equestrian family. Their father would have been a frequent visitor and may have taken them on campaign with him, depending on their ages. But there is little doubt that it was during this period that the seeds of Pompey's future greatness were planted. We know from Plutarch's biography of Pompey that his father told stories of ancient heroes and mythical figures to his boys, which captured their imagination and inspired them with ambition. He also encouraged them to learn by heart the verses of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which is likely another factor that contributed to Pompey's future military brilliance. These stories contained within them tales of courage, cunning, strategy, leadership, and above all else, glory. At this time, there was a strong taboo against Roman generals writing about their own deeds. Military commanders were expected to pass on written records of their campaigns to professionally literary historians to be recorded and passed down through the generations. Even so, there was nothing stopping these histories from being epic poems, and they often contained elements of mythology and folklore. It was also during this period that the young Pompeians would have heard tales of Rome's recent civil wars, and the great deeds of men like Marius and Sulla. Both men were seen as demigods by their supporters, and both were celebrated in poetry and song. We do want to know if young Pompey's mind was filled with admiration for the exploits of these men, but it is clear from his later career that he was familiar with the deeds of his supposed heroes, and saw himself as continuing their legacy. Now, a lot has been made of the supposed animosity between Pompey and Marius later in life. And yes, it's true that Pompey opposed Marius's bid to become consul in 86 BCE. But it's important to remember that this was a time when politics were incredibly fluid. Both Pompey and Marius would switch sides at various points throughout the Civil War, usually for strategic reasons. So while it is easy to see the rivalry between these two as a continuation of their fathers, that just wasn't the case. On top of that, Marius's opposition to Sulla had actually ended up saving Pompey's life. As we covered in our previous episode, when Sulla came into power, proscribed meaning put to death or exiled many of his enemies. And since Strabo had served under and supported Marius in the past, he was understandably concerned that his family might be targeted, and so he sent them back to Asculum to stay with relatives. Little did he know that Sulla would soon march his army south and lay siege to the city. Strabo was forced to flee to Greece, never to return to Italy again, and this meant that young Pompey and his family were stuck in Asculum, with no hope of escape. All they could do was wait for the inevitable. But as it turned out, Marius, who was in exile at this point, managed to negotiate a peace deal with Sulla, which led to Strabo's recall to Rome and the end of the siege. Now, after this scare, it is clear that Strabo was very eager to get his family out of danger and back to Rome. So he must have felt confident that his enemies were defeated and that he could finally breathe easy. But this was far from the case. Not only did Sulla go on to defeat Marius and seize Rome a second time, but Strabo's troubles were just beginning. He found himself accused of supporting a rival candidate at the elections, and this earned him a place on Sulla's list of proscriptions. Once again, young Pompey found himself in mortal danger. It seems as though Strabo reacted in much the same way as he had done before, by sending his family away to safety, this time to the Greek city of Athens. Then he fled south to seek his fortune. Strabo did manage to rise through the ranks of the cavalry and achieved the esteemed title of Triumphator. But in the end, he would lose his life in battle, having died fighting alongside Pompeius Rufus against the armies of Sextus Pompeius. This is a little ironic, considering that Sextus would later become Pompey's half-brother, and the two would fight together as allies in the Third Mithridatic War. But that's a story for another time. In the meantime, while Strabo was fighting his way up the social ladder, his widow and young sons were enjoying the comforts of Athens. It was here that young Pompey finished his education, studying rhetoric, literature, and philosophy, as well as learning the skills of horsemanship and athletics. By all accounts, he was an exceptional student who excelled at everything he turned his mind to. However, he developed a particular interest in military matters, and it said that he would spend hours upon hours reading over the tactics and strategies of famous generals. It was during this period that he became enamored with the art of war and developed the skills that would one day make him the greatest general of his generation. When the family eventually returned to Rome, Pompey wasted no time in launching his new career. He took the title of consul in 89 BCE, the youngest person ever to hold the office at the age of only 34 years old. And so ends our second chapter. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave us a like and consider joining our community to get behind-the-scenes information and updates. Thanks once again for your support. Goodbye. Chapter 3. Young Commander. At the age of just 23. Gnaeus Pompeius. Magnus raised his own troops and joined the civil war on the side of Sulla. He spent 2 years campaigning in Sicily and Africa, winning several important victories and earning himself the title Magnus the Great. But was he really so great? And what about his relationship with Sulla? What was that all about? Well, here's some thoughts from someone who's been thinking about this for a while. This is my channel. Let's get into it. Pompey the Great was born into an old and established Roman family of the same name. They weren't patricians, which meant they didn't have that hereditary right to the consulship. Instead, they had risen to power through their own merit, hard work, and sheer bloody-mindedness, through connections made while serving in various elected offices. The elder Pompey was able to secure for his son an influential patron in the person of Gaius Marius. So when young Pompey was just 17 years old, he was attached to Marius's staff and served with him during his campaigns in Spain and in the social war against Rome. Thessalian allies. As I've said in previous videos, there's not much to go on here. We know very little about this young man, but we do know that by the time he was 20, he had achieved the prestigious rank of military tribune, probably by using the standard method of bribery. As a result, he was serving under none other than Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man who had recently seized power in Rome by marching his army into the city and defeating his rival, Marius. Now, if you've watched my other videos on Sulla or the Social War, then you may remember me talking about how this guy assembled his army of 86, bringing together all sorts of disparate elements from across Italy. Not only did he have full-fledged Roman citizens who fought as heavy infantry, he also had these weird hybrid soldiers known as Pages Italicus, Italians who were armed and trained like Roman infantry, but who remained technically outside the citizenship rights enjoyed by the citizens. And if we take the evidence presented in Plutarch's biography of Sulla, we can see that young Pompey served with one of these units, specifically with a group of Samnite mercenaries. Why would Sulla have put a teenage boy in charge of such men? Well, the answer might be as simple as because he could. After all, Sulla wasn't exactly known for being a nice guy. In fact, he was quite cruel and he showed no mercy on his enemies. That's why he prescribed them, putting their names up on a prescription list and allowing anyone to kill them and confiscate their property. In fact, even his friends and allies weren't safe from his fits of rage. But here's where things get kinda weird, because while Sulla was extremely hot-headed and quick to anger, he was also very aware of the value of public perception, and so he would often fake being magnanimous towards his enemies, pretending to be noble and generous when the reality was that he was actually a vicious tyrant. You know those people who pretend to be your friend, but then turn out to be your enemy? Yeah, Sulla was kinda like that. And what better way to show the world his false benevolence than by taking a young, inexperienced kid, basically a child, and putting him in charge of his elite troops. He must have thought it would look good to everyone else, especially back in Rome. to show off how kind and merciful he was towards the children of his political enemies. You know, like one of those photos rich people used to take with starving children in Africa? But instead of doing that, Sulla took a child soldier and made him a hero. I mean, it's such an obvious lie, but it was one that most people bought. We know from Appian that when Pompey was just 19, he campaigned in Picenum, where he defeated a band of brigands, led by a certain Athenian. According to the historian, Athenian was related to Marius and had taken arms against Sulla. Now, it's possible that this was simply an obscure detail, a random bandit leader who had a name similar to Marius. But I think there's more to it than that. I think this story was deliberately concocted to present Pompey as a young and brave general who inherited the traits of his mentor, Marius, and who now defeated bandits in the name of Sulla. You see, at this point, Sulla was fighting the main bulk of his war against the armies of the Marian faction, and so it wouldn't make sense for him to send his son-in-law, a 19-year-old kid with zero experience, to fight a battle in central Italy. No, I think there's a narrative thread running through these stories, a deliberate attempt to present Pompey as the inheritor of Marius's legacy. And if that's true, then this also means that Sulla knew perfectly well who Pompey was, what he was capable of, and how he was likely to develop in the future. He had spent a year campaigning alongside Sulla, first in Spain and then in Greece, and he had proven himself to be a competent commander. But it wasn't until he was given command of his own troops that he really got to shine. You see, Sulla was cautious. He knew that he couldn't rely on the legions alone to win the war, and so he often called upon allied kings to do his bidding. For example, he helped King Archelaus of Cappadocia to seize power, and he invited King Mithridates of Pontus to attack the Pontic king. It was this reliance on allies that allowed Pompey to really stand out, because while Sulla was besieging cities, he was left with huge garrisons to manage, and so it fell to Pompey to lead the light troops and forage for supplies. In other words, to plunder the countryside around the siege camps. While this isn't necessarily a glamorous task, it shows us an important facet of Pompey's personality, namely his incredible drive to acquire booty. You see, Roman generals didn't get paid very much, and their power and wealth came mostly from the spoils of war. Sure, they could receive grants of land from the state, and they could loot cities, but the best booty went to the soldiers. And so a good general knew how to reward his men, and Pompey was particularly adept at this. Plutarch tells us that he built his reputation in part due to his generosity in handing out plunder. And this, of course, won him the adoration of his troops. But while Pompey was certainly an ambitious man who craved glory and fortune, we should note that Sulla was always the one to take the initiative. The young general never attacked an enemy position without first asking for permission. Even after he earned the title Magnus, he still needed Sulla's approval before engaging in battle. He might have been eager to prove himself, but he also knew his limits. In fact, it was during a battle in northern Africa that he almost lost his life. His horse was killed beneath him and he was wounded several times. It was only thanks to the intervention of a general named Manius that he survived. In other words, despite the image we have of Pompey as this great general, it was really Sulla who was making the decisions and Pompey who was carrying them out. So what about the title Magnus? Where did that come from? Well, it was earned during the siege of a city called Thapsus in northern Africa. According to Appian, Pompey managed to storm the city walls, capture the citadel, and defeat the Numidian cavalry, thus earning the title Magnus. But once again, this doesn't really tell us anything about his skills as a general. You see, storming a wall isn't necessarily an impressive feat, because the Romans were masters of siege, and defeating Numidian cavalry isn't exactly difficult either, because they were notoriously undisciplined. And so, despite all the legends surrounding Pompey, I don't think he was nearly as great as he's made out to be. I mean, he was undoubtedly brave and ambitious and lucky, too, no doubt. But he was also operating in a war where the Romans were facing undisciplined opponents. Furthermore, if we look at the later careers of Pompey and Sulla, we see that while the former became famous for his brilliant military victories, the latter never even commanded an army in the field. Now, I'm not saying that one man was better than the other. After all, they were different individuals with different skills. but I am saying that it's pretty clear who the better general was. And let's not forget that it was Sulla who chose to align himself with the younger man, who recognized his potential and brought him along as his son. In fact, it was Sulla who shaped Pompey's career, giving him opportunities and helping him rise through the ranks. And so while we might think of Pompey as this independent actor who forged his own path in life, we shouldn't forget the crucial role played by his father. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. A special thanks to my supporters for their support. Thanks for watching. See you next time. This is Rome in the year 72 BC, after 3 years of civil war. Pompey has defeated the Marian forces in Italy and established himself as a popular general in Rome. But he doesn't want to stop there. He wants more glory, more power. And so he sets his sights on the province of Hispania, where Rome has been bogged down in a long and costly war against a brilliant rebel named Sertorius. After securing Rome's commitment for 1 more year of war, Pompey arrives in southern France and begins the difficult task of putting together a force capable of taking on. The task proves harder than expected. Most of the Roman soldiers stationed in the province don't want to fight another year of war, especially not against a fellow Roman, so they refuse to join Pompey's campaign, unless he personally guarantees their discharge from military service. This not only ties up a significant portion of his own personal funds, but also leaves him with an army mostly made up of volunteers, who are fighting for personal gain rather than for the glory of Rome. Despite these Pompeys, men were far better trained and equipped than Sertorius's ragtag band of rebels, which at first gave Pompey the advantage. He defeats the Sertorian cavalry easily, and even manages to capture some of their artillery. But while he is celebrating his victory, his engineers inform him that the captured artillery uses ammunition that Rome doesn't have the capability to manufacture. It's a devastating blow that could very well cost him the entire campaign. But instead of panicking, Pompey takes a deep breath, thinks about his options, and decides to find a way around the problem. First, he establishes supply depots near the front lines with enough supplies to last several months. This way, if he can hold out for just a little longer, reinforcements from Rome should be able to arrive before his supplies run out. Then he turns his attention back to the battlefield and figures out how to use the captured artillery without any ammunition. Instead of using them to bombard Surtur's forces, he uses them as siege weapons to lay siege to the cities that Surtur's forces control. One by one, he lays siege to their strongholds, capturing cities and forcing Sertorius's forces to abandon their positions and retreat deeper into Spain. As the campaign drags on, Pompey faces new challenges. His allies are growing impatient and start to look for other opportunities to advance their own interests. And when they hear that Crassus has defeated the forces of Brutus in Greece, they too want to leave and go home. Seeing this, Pompey knows that he needs to finish the war quickly, so he pushes his troops hard, forcing them to march through rough terrain, often without any supplies. Finally, after a year of campaigning, he catches up to Sertorius and his exhausted and starving men at the Battle of the River Styx. Pompey now has the advantage, and his artillery is able to bombard Sertorius's forces freely, since they no longer have access to ammunition. Sertorius's men are tired and demoralized, and they begin to lose the battle. But then something unexpected happens. Pompey's artillery, in a moment of bad luck, hits an abandoned Roman camp instead of Sertorius's forces. This gives Sertorius and his men hope that Rome is uninvincible, and that they might still be able to win the war. With a renewed sense of energy, Sertorius rallies his troops and launches a surprise attack against Pompey's forces. The Romans are caught off guard and soon find themselves in full flight. Pompey watches in disbelief as his men turn tail and run away from the battlefield. The cavalry tries to stop them, but they too are put to flight. In the end, Pompey's army is routed and forced to flee. To make matters worse, one of his lieutenants is killed in the battle. The war is going badly, and even the people of Rome are starting to turn on him. Pompey is forced to return to the capital to defend himself. But even there, he is unable to escape the shadow of his defeat. The next year, Sertorius leads a massive invasion of southern Hispania, defeating Pompey's brother and forcing him to retreat to Africa. With each passing day, it seems like Sertorius is unstoppable. But then suddenly, he disappeared. He had grown increasingly paranoid in recent years and surrounded himself with bodyguards, which made him unpopular with many of his officers. while staying at a friend's villa for the winter. Sertorius grows suspicious of a conspiracy against him and orders his bodyguards to search the house. They discover a secret passageway leading out of the villa, and believe that Sertorius's host is planning to kidnap him and take over the rebellion. In the ensuing chaos, Sertorius is stabbed to death by a member of his own bodyguard. Without their leader, the rebels collapse and Pompey is able to return to Hispania and finish the war. He is hailed as a hero in Rome and his political career is secured. So what lessons can we learn from this story? Well, first of all, never underestimate your enemy. Even if you think that you're stronger than them, always be prepared for anything. Secondly, don't be afraid to learn from your mistakes. When Pompey realized that he couldn't win the war in Hispania, he didn't panic. He took a step back and thought about what he needed to do to win. And finally, remember that every great success story has its setbacks and failures along the way. Don't let this discourage you. Just keep moving forward, and eventually you will succeed. So tell me, what do you think? What would you have done differently if you were in Pompey's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you happen to be using. It really helps us out, and we appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you want to get more from the series, check out our website, where you'll find additional resources for each episode, including maps, timelines, and even more. We've got 2 websites that are dedicated to bringing history to life for people just like you. Our flagship site offers full-length episodes and ad-free, plus exclusive companion podcasts and maps. And if that's not enough, we also have another platform with even more exclusive content, including a series that dives into the stories of those who lived, loved, and died during the ancient Roman Empire. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Chapter 5, Shared Glory with Crassus. The year is 71 BCE, and the great Spartacus slave revolt has finally been put down. Somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean, the tribune Gaius Cassius Longinus surveys the wreckage of the ships in his fleet. He watches men struggle out of the water, many wounded, some bearing shackles, all of them survivors of the recent battle against the slave army of Spartacus. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and simply outmaneuvered by the forces of Crassus, whose fleet had anchored off the coast of Greece at the same time that Pompey's army was striking Spartacus's main force inland. And now it seemed their efforts had been for nothing. But as they limped back to shore, he would have seen the smoke rising from the eastern hills, the signal that Crassus and his legions had defeated the slaves after all. Cassius himself had been shipwrecked and forced to swim to shore. His leg was badly hurt. In fact, it may well have been broken during the disaster. Yet he immediately set about making sure the remaining ships in his fleet were repaired. For Cassius understood something very important. If they were going to share credit for ending this war, then they needed to get these ships back into the water and sail back to Rome as quickly as possible. Indeed, when he heard the news from Crassus, he sent a herald ahead to ensure that he got credit for defeating the slaves as well. And it worked. When Cassius and his fleet arrived in the Bay of Naples, the Senate had already voted him a triumph. But even as he prepared for his victory parade through the streets of Rome, Cassius knew he'd only gotten that far, thanks to one man, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, if not the entire world. Crassus, who'd assembled an elite army of 6 legions, paid for out of his own pocket, had marched them east to meet the threat of Spartacus. It was a dangerous mission, but one that was necessary to protect Rome and its allies. And indeed, Crassus had proven equal to the task, destroying the slave army and saving the Republic. So how would Rome reward him? Well, probably not with a triumph. Crassus wasn't a Roman aristocrat. He didn't hold a consul's office, and that was generally considered a prerequisite for that honor. But still, Cassius figured he'd get an ovation, perhaps even a crown. But when Crassus's own fleet brought him home, arriving first in Brundisium before sailing on to Rome, he found that people weren't exactly clamoring to give him any sort of hero's welcome. In fact, nobody even expected him to ask for one. After all, it was said that when he'd left Rome to campaign against Spartacus, he'd done so without even saying goodbye to his wife. He was that kind of man, a soldier who cared only for 2 things: money and success. Some thought there was little difference between the two. Both could be bought, and in the case of Spartacus, Crassus had done just that. buying off the leaders of the revolt, promising them money and land in exchange for surrendering their armies. Many senators felt that Crassus had robbed them of the opportunity to defeat Spartacus themselves, and while no one would ever say it publicly, they likely hoped that Crassus might die on campaign, that perhaps disease or the elements would claim him and save Rome from his brazen opportunism. In the end, neither fate nor fortune would intervene. Crassus returned to Rome a hero in name only. Having defeated Spartacus, he was entitled to a triumph, but he never got one. Instead, he made do with an ovation, a lesser form of public celebration reserved for those who had unquite reached the same level of success. And yet, for all the resentment, there was no denying that Rome had been saved. Crassus had defeated Spartacus and ended the most serious threat to the Republic's security in a generation, and so it was decided that both he and Pompey, who had also played a crucial role in crushing the revolt, would become consuls for the following year, 70 BCE. An unprecedented situation, a double It was only the second time in Roman history such a thing had happened, the first being back in 594 BCE. When two brothers held the consulship, the year Rome adopted its first written constitution. Pompey and Crassus had nothing in common. They were different ages, from different social classes, and they'd taken different paths to the top, but they had a shared enemy in the tribunes of the plebs, who were attempting to wrest control of the Republic away from the Senate and give it to the assemblies instead. The tribunes had gained a lot of power during the crisis of the late 80s, when they successfully used their veto power to prevent Marius and Sulla from taking revenge on their political enemies. But now that the crisis had passed and Rome was enjoying a hard-won peace, the Optimates wanted that power back. And who better to lead the charge than the two men who'd ended the recent slave revolt? Now, the uneasy alliance between Pompey and Crassus survived for a single year, each man trying to use the other's popularity to advance his own agenda, but their goals were fundamentally opposed. Pompey, with his military background and aristocratic connections, was popular with the Crassus, with his wealth and reputation as a self-made man, was popular with the populars. That they managed to work together at all was a testament to the desire for stability that pervaded Rome in the aftermath of the civil wars. But it was only a matter of time before their differences overcame them, and the result was a series of political reforms intended to restore the power of the tribunes of the plebs. Crassus pushed through legislation, restoring the tribunes' power of veto, and Pompey largely stayed out of the way, focusing instead on foreign affairs and the consolidation of his power in the East. But if he hoped to build on his father's achievements and create a stable province out of the wreckage of Mithridates' empire, he wouldn't be able to do it without the full support of the Senate. And so he agreed to let Crassus push through the reforms, hoping that once they were done, he'd have enough support to deal with the Eastern crisis. Unfortunately, things didn't work out that way. Gaius Cassius Longinus, the man who'd sailed with Crassus against the slaves, had lost his leg in the Battle of the Seas. But even with a disability that would keep him from military service, he still wanted influence, and he decided that the best way to get that was to become a tribune of the plebs, with the support of the populares. He and his fellow tribunes attempted to pass a law granting Roman citizenship to all Italians, the non-slave inhabitants of Italy who lived outside of Rome itself. The idea had some merit. Italy was a collection of peoples bound together under Rome's hegemony, but lacking any real legal or political status. But Cassius's proposal went too far. Even the populares thought it unwise to make every Italian a Roman citizen. Instead, they tried to limit the law to Latium, the region around Rome itself, and to use it as leverage against Crassus. If he agreed to sponsor the law, they would drop their opposition to his reforms. It wasn't much, but given that they held the balance of power in the assembly, it was a nug, and Crassus agreed. But when he presented the law to the Senate, it went over like a fart in a bath. The senators considered it outrageous, and the populares considered it a betrayal. Neither side would accept the reforms unless the law granting citizenship to Latium was repealed. So the deadlock continued, and both sides prepared for war. Pompey chose to remain neutral, sending out the governor of Asia to defend Rome in case violence broke out. But he was in a difficult position. On one side was Crassus, the man who had helped him achieve the consulship and secure his return to Rome. On the other was the Senate, which he needed to court if he was going to do anything in the East. As for Crassus, he faced a similar choice. He could continue to antagonize the tribunes and risk another civil war, or he could try to come to some sort of compromise with them. But whatever he did, he was trapped. The year of the double consuls had turned into a disaster, and if he wanted to survive in politics, he needed Pompey's help. But if he asked for it, it would come at a price he might not be willing to pay. Next time on the History of Rome, find out what that price is, and see if Crassus is willing to pay it. Will he come to terms with the tribunes? Will he ally himself with Pompey against a common enemy? Or will he go down in flames, taking everything he's ever gained with him? Find out next time on the History of Rome. Hey everyone, welcome to the premier source for exclusive ad-free episodes of the History of Rome, as well as tons of bonus material, including deleted scenes, early access to new episodes, and our brand new series, Ancient Warfare. You can check out the first episode right now on our site. Also, we just launched our second podcast feed, which features ad-free episodes of our regular show, as well as exclusive bonus content. You can listen to the latest episode right now, wherever you get your podcasts. Finally, thank you to all of our supporters, especially those of you in our Discord community. We couldn't have done it without you. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Sweeping the seas. The Pirate War, 67 BCE. Rome has a problem. A big problem. And this time it's not the neighbors stirring up trouble or ambitious generals looking to seize power. No, this time it's the seas. Well, actually, it's the people who live on the seas. Specifically, it's the pirates who are waging war on Rome. So in this episode of Grounded History, we're going to look at how Rome won the only truly naval war it ever fought. We begin our story in 67 BCE, when Rome is facing a dire situation. See, its granaries are running low on grain. Normally, Rome would simply import grain from its allies and clients throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, the grain ships were due to arrive any day now. But there was a problem. Pirates. For years, various Mediterranean states had complained about these bands of thieves preying on shipping lanes. The Romans had even made attempts to stop them, but without much success. Now, though, the pirates had become bolder and were even attacking Roman ships off the coast of Africa. The worst part was that they seemed unstoppable. It wasn't that Rome didn't have a navy. It did, and it was the largest in the Mediterranean by far. But the thing was that the Roman navy was designed for moving legions around the Mediterranean, not for fighting pirates. Sure, the Roman ships could engage the pirates. They just weren't very good at it. The truth was, for all of Rome's might, there was very little it could do about these fast, maneuverable ships. The Senate turned quickly to sending an expeditionary force to deal with the pirates once and for all. Who should lead such a force? Well, everyone agreed that it should be one man. A man known throughout Rome for his ruthlessness and skill in battle. A man who had single-handedly defeated the Roman Republic's greatest enemies in the late 80s and early 70s. A man who currently held the title of the most powerful general in Rome. That man was Gaius Marius, except he wasn't. He was Quintus Caecilius, Metellus Pius. The Senate hesitated to give Pompey such vast command over both land and sea, but they did not have much of a choice. This was a crisis, and they needed results. Fast. So on the Lupercal, February 67 BCE, the Senate voted to grant Pompey sole command over all naval and military forces needed to defeat the pirates. For 5 years, Pompey would have sole authority to raise and spend money, wage war and make peace in the Mediterranean. He could recruit sailors and soldiers, use any force necessary, and even execute anyone impeding the war effort. Essentially, the Senate had just given Pompey the power to do whatever he wanted to put down the rebellion. This must have been quite the moment for Pompey. Here, he was being given the chance to finally win a war on his own. Sure, he had defeated powerful armies before, but those armies had come to him. This time, however, he would have to seek out the enemy and bring them down. And what's more, he would have to do it on their home turf. This was Pompey's chance to finally prove himself as a great general and strategist. But there was a bigger incentive than just personal glory. You see, after a lifetime of military campaigns, Pompey had grown tired of fighting. His health was suffering, and his political influence had waned significantly since his great victories. The pirates were his last chance to gain the lasting fame and glory he deserved. If he failed, however, he he would likely never get another chance. And so began the most interesting chapter of Pompey's life. While many Romans were calling for extreme measures to be taken against the pirates, Pompey was surprisingly moderate. Instead of immediately gathering troops and marching on the pirates, he spent several months carefully planning his campaign. Pompey realized that this war would be very different from the ones he had fought before. He was fighting a foe that lived on the seas, striking swiftly and disappearing before any real engagement could take place. To the fiat, Pompey needed to think like them. He began by recruiting 180 merchant ships to serve as transports for his army and supplies. He then set about assembling the most capable fleet Rome had ever seen. He built over 200 new ships, mostly queen-quiremes, and larger, which were comparable to the pirate vessels. But what may have been most important was that he used these ships to blockade key ports and prevent reinforcements and supplies from reaching the pirates. Then he sailed west to meet the enemy head-on. Pompey's fleet first encountered the pirates off the coast of Sardinia, where they gave his ships a hard fight. But Pompey's larger vessels eventually prevailed. As the pirates fled, Pompey ordered his men to pursue them, utilizing his newly invented boarding hooks. With their larger ships, the Romans were able to quickly end most engagements before they even reached open water. Soon, the western Mediterranean was secure, and grain shipments were arriving in Rome once again. But the main pirate bases were still intact. Realizing that he couldn't win by brute force alone, Pompey used his genius to adapt his tactics. You see, while the Romans were easily able to defeat the pirates at sea, capturing them alive proved difficult. Most pirates preferred to die rather than surrender. But what if the Romans didn't need to capture any pirates? What if instead they simply convinced the pirates to surrender their ships? To accomplish this, Pompey had 40 of his best ships stripped down, fitted with sails that made them indistinguishable from the pirates, and filled with men dressed as pirates. Then he sent them into the eastern Mediterranean under the command of Lucius Licinius Lucullus. Their mission was simple. All they had to do was find a pirate ship and pretend to be pirates themselves. All they needed to do was convince the other pirates that they were fellow raiders looking to split some plunder. The ruse worked perfectly. One by one, the decoy ships met with unsuspecting pirates who willingly surrendered their ships, thinking they were joining a much larger fleet. Within a few weeks, Lucullus had acquired dozens of ships this way. By the end of the year, in fact, Lucullus had captured nearly half of the pirate fleet without firing a single shot. But pirates, or no pirates, the war was taking longer than anyone expected, and Pompey was growing frustrated. He knew that to finish the war, he had to strike directly at the pirate strongholds. So in 66 BCE, he took his fleet to the coast of Cilicia and began a siege. Now, Pompey could have simply bombarded the coastal cities, but he didn't. Instead, he offered the pirates a choice. Surrender your ships, and we'll spare your lives. Or resist, and we'll kill you all. Most pirates chose wisely, but a few decided to fight. The result was swift and brutal. Within days, the Roman catapults had breached the city walls, and Pompey's men were swarming over the docks, seizing every ship they could find. For the next few years, Pompey continued to sweep the seas, chasing down any remaining pirates and crushing any new rebellions. By the time his 5-year mandate was up, AID single-handedly ended the scourge of piracy in the Mediterranean. When news of Pompey's victory reached Rome, he was greeted as a hero. The people celebrated for days, and the Senate showered him with honors, statues, and a triumph. Probably the greatest of Pompey's career, but perhaps the greatest honor was that everyone finally recognized Pompey the Great for what he really was, the greatest general Rome had ever seen. He had conquered vast swaths of the Mediterranean, waged wars against kings, and defeated Rome's greatest enemies. But it was his defeat of the pirates that showed the world the true extent of Pompey's skills. After all, he hadn't defeated an army on land or a rival navy on open seas. He had defeated an enemy unlike any other, pirates who struck from the shadows and hid amongst the innocent. He had swept them from the seas and brought peace back to the Mediterranean, and that is why, in my opinion, Pompey's victory over the pirates is the greatest feat of the entire Roman Republic. Thank you for watching. Rome has grown from a small village to a powerful city to controlling most of the Mediterranean. They have defeated Carthage twice, and now they're taking on the greatest threat yet, the vast kingdom of Pontus. Join us as we learn about Chapter 7, Eastern triumphs, Conqueror of the East. Our story begins with Rome being at war with King Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus. Now, if you don't know who Pontus is, he was pretty much the king of the Black Sea region. And while Rome had previously ignored him because they were dealing with other problems, that's no longer the case. Now, after winning their second Punic War, Rome had just annexed Greece, and they're ready to take on this new foe. But there was one problem. The Roman Senate didn't really want to go to war with this guy. The Pontic king had good relations with Rome until recently, even adopting Roman customs and sending his son to Rome to be educated. And to make things more complicated, Rome was already at war with the Gauls, and the Senate didn't want to add another front. Instead, they wanted Mithridates to return some Greek cities he recently conquered. But when this failed, the Senate finally gave in and declared war. In 66, Rome began its invasion of the East under the command of Lucius Licinius. He was joined by Gnaeus, Pompeius, Magnus, or just Pompey. But despite having superior numbers, the Romans lost battle after battle. That's why in 64, Lucullus was replaced by Pompey, who was given full control over the war. The next 2 years were some of the bloodiest in history. Entire legions were wiped out, cities were pillaged, and thousands upon thousands perished. But slowly but surely, Pompey began to turn the tide. He defeated the Pontic navy, invaded Asia Minor, and even chased Mithridates all the way back to Armenia. In 63, he took the Pontic capital of Sinope and forced Mithridates to sue for peace. The following year, the peace treaty was ratified in Rome, and Pompey was given a hero's welcome. He was praised by poets, artists, and orators, including a young Julius Caesar. But the story doesn't end here. No, not even close. You see, while everyone was celebrating, Pompey was still in the East. You see, the Senate didn't like that Pompey made peace with Mithridates without consulting them first, so they passed a law stating that no general could make peace with anyone outside of Italy without their approval. So Pompey, well, he just ignored them and continued his campaign. When the Senate heard about it, they got even angrier and ordered him to surrender all his eastern conquests. But again, he just ignored them. And so Rome had a civil war on their hands. The Senate sided with one of Pompey's rivals, Gaius Cassius Longinus, and made him the governor of Cisalpine Gaul. With this new authority, Cassius immediately began raising an army in the north. Meanwhile, Pompey's allies were doing the same in the south. The fighting was brutal. Many died on both sides, and in the end, it wasn't even close. Pompey easily defeated Cassius's forces and executed him. Next, Pompey marched on Rome with his army, forcing the Senate to flee. From there, he took control of the government and became the de facto ruler of Rome. Now, before you get too excited, this wasn't a glorious victory. Rome was bankrupt. Their treasury was depleted from years of constant warfare. The Civil War drained what little money they had left, and the people were exhausted from constant conflict. It was during this time that Cicero gave his famous speech, "The Roman people demand peace." But despite the cost, Rome was now firmly in control of the Mediterranean. The only power capable of challenging them was now their client. Now when Pompey took control of the eastern provinces, he did something very important. He carefully chose local rulers who would keep the peace and collect taxes for Rome. He also divided the province into 3 parts and appointed trusted generals to govern them. And this was very important because these areas had never been under direct Roman rule before. So there was bound to be unrest. But thanks to Pompey's careful administration, everything went smoothly. The first region was Syria. This area encompassed the former Seleucid Empire, which stretched from the Taurus Mountains in the south to the borders of Persia in the east. The entire region was highly coveted by Rome and their allies, and many wanted it for themselves, but it was Pompey who received it. As the official Roman governor, he greatly expanded Roman power into Arabia and even defeated the Nabatean king Aretas. To secure the borders, he built forts along the Euphrates River, creating the foundation for the future Roman province of Syria. Next, we have Asia Minor. This is the Anatolian Peninsula, the ancient heartland of Greek civilization, and it was absolutely crucial for the prosperity of the Roman world. You see, this region was extremely wealthy and produced most of the grain needed for the Roman diet. It was also home to many great cities such as Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum. But most importantly, it was home to several Greek kingdoms. There was Bithynia, Cappadocia, Galatia, and many others. Most of these were client states, which meant they were technically independent, but had to pay tribute to Rome. The only exception was the Kingdom of Pontus, which was now a Roman province. And then lastly, we have the region of the Levant, which encompassed modern-day Israel, Judea, Phoenicia, and Egypt. This was the region where Rome established their first foothold in the East. After defeating King Ptolemy VIII, they annexed it and turned it into a Roman province. Soon after, they would do the same with the Kingdom of Nabutia, which controlled the important trade routes through the Arabian Peninsula. So overall, Rome's eastern provinces included Syria, Asia Minor, the Levant, and parts of Arabia. These provinces would serve as the cornerstone for centuries of future conquests. They generated massive amounts of wealth for Rome, provided ample amounts of soldiers, and greatly strengthened Roman defenses. You know, when you think about it, it makes sense that Pompey was celebrated for his eastern conquests. He single-handedly defeated one of Rome's greatest enemies. He annexed several territories and installed client kings throughout the region. And he did all of this with very little help. I mean, when he entered Sinope, the Pontic capital, there was no one to stop him. All of his rivals had either been defeated or had fled. And so Rome had total control over the entire East. To be honest, I think Pompey deserves more credit than he gets. Sure, he lost the Civil War. But think about how much he accomplished. He conquered several kingdoms, ended the Third Mithridatic War, annexed Pontus, and defeated the Pontic navy. Plus, he brought stability to a chaotic region, set up client kingdoms, expanded into Arabia, built forts along the Euphrates, and pacified the entire region. Honestly, it's hard to imagine what Rome would look like without him. But unfortunately, he didn't have much time to enjoy his victories. See, when the Senate learned about his actions, they were furious. They stripped him of his command, confiscated his fortune, and banned him from returning to Rome. And so, Pompey the Great spent his last years in exile, eventually dying in 48 BCE still. His legacy lived on through the writings of historians and the stories of his deeds. Even Caesar admitted that Pompey was the only man capable of defeating him in battle. But what about the East? Now that it was under Roman rule, what happened next? Well, you'll have to wait until our next episode to find out. As you can tell, I put a lot of effort into making these videos. Research, write, record, edit, and publish every single one of these episodes. That's why it would mean the world to me if you liked this video. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and subscribe. It'll really help us grow. Also, feel free to check out my social media. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. This is a history hot tip. Today we're going to look at Chapter 8 of Robert Graves's book, Pompey the Great, which is entitled The Man at the Height of Power. It's me. Let's get into it. So, in the last chapter, we left our hero Pompey having just defeated the armies of the Roman king in a battle near the Pharsalus River in Greece, and we saw that this victory over the numerically superior army of Mithridates, the sixth, not only made him famous, but also very rich, as he took a huge amount of booty back to Rome with him. We then saw in the next chapter how this unprecedented victory was received in Rome with great public displays, monuments, statues, paintings, even a special issue coin minted to commemorate his achievements. But now, back in Rome, the Senate is getting a little nervous about the extent of Pompey's power and his influence over Roman affairs. They view him with a mix of suspicion and jealousy, really, and they start to try to push him out of the city and keep him away from the levers of political power. So, Pompey decides to go on another campaign to secure his position. This time, he heads to Spain, where there have been some revolts among the allies of Rome in the region. He puts down this revolt fairly quickly and easily, and then he brings his troops back home as well, expecting adulation and congratulations. But instead, he gets the cold shoulder from the Senate. Now, in order to understand why the Senate behaves like this towards Pompey, we need to take a brief detour to look at what the Senate actually is. You see, when most people think of ancient Rome, They imagined the Roman Forum with all of these senators walking around in their togas and having important conversations. But the reality is that the Forum was way too small to hold all of the senators. In fact, the Forum was so small that only a couple hundred people could fit in there comfortably. Instead, the Senate met in a place called the Senate House, or the Senatus, which was located on top of the Capitol building. The problem with the Senate House is that it was way too far away from the action. In fact, it was so far away from the center of Roman politics that we actually do not know what happened there for the first 4 centuries of its existence, because there are no first-hand accounts of debates that were held there. You might think that this would make the Senate a rather powerless group, but this was not the case at all. That is because being a senator didn't just mean that you had a job and met in a particular place. Being a senator was a status. In fact, it was the highest possible status that a Roman male could achieve, and it came with certain privileges and rights. For example, the senators had a legal monopoly on all higher offices in the Roman state. There were only 2 offices that were closed off to them: the consulship and the censorship. These offices required a plebiscite vote, but the Senate effectively controlled who ran for both of these positions. Also, because they were senators, these men were exempt from most forms of taxation. Furthermore, they had the right to appear before any magistrate in Rome without needing to make an appointment. They also got free legal representation. And if a senator was tried for a crime, the burden of proof lay with the prosecution. In other words, he was considered innocent until proven guilty. Finally, senators were forbidden from performing any manual labor. Slavery was legal in Rome, of course, and many senators owned slaves. But senators themselves were forbidden from working like slaves. So, as you can imagine, becoming a senator was every Roman male's dream. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy to become a senator. You had to be related to one in most cases, and there was a limit to how many senators there could be. According to tradition, the number of senators could never exceed 300. If there were more than 300 senators, then a vote would be taken to decide who stayed and who went. So, since there was such limited opportunity for advancement in Roman society, once you were a senator, you wanted to stay a senator. And what the Senate wanted above all else was more power. They didn't want any threats to their way of life. And right now, they view Pompey as a threat. You see, ever since the days of Augustus, Rome had been ruled by an informal group of men known as the equestrian class. These men weren't quite senators, but they were higher in status than the common folk, and they were usually incredibly wealthy. They controlled much of the economic and financial power in Rome. Now, since Pompey's rise to prominence, he has done a lot of business with this group. For example, his brother, who managed his estates while he was campaigning, was actually a former slave who bought his way out of slavery and then into the equestrian class. And several of Pompey's close friends were equestrians. Even his wife, Julia, came from the equestrian class. Her father, Marcus, was a former governor of Asia Minor, and her grandfather had been a prominent moneylender. To make matters worse for Pompey, the leading members of the Senate viewed him as a braggart, someone who was full of himself and deserved everything he got. In fact, Cicero would later describe Pompey as one who was, quote, excessive in all things. He was even accused of putting too much trust in his own abilities and those of his sons, and this didn't help his popularity in the Senate. So, since the Senate didn't want to allow Pompey to come back into Rome with his army, he did something drastic. He decided to disband his army. As soon as he arrived back in Rome, he began to formally discharge his soldiers and send them home. Those who had followed him for years knew that this day was coming, and they accepted their discharge papers gracefully. Pompey, however, was very sad to see his men go. After all, he had spent more than 20 years with these men, and they had become more like family to him than anything else. He tried to console himself by reminding himself that they would always remain his friends. But deep down, he knew that this was probably not true. Soldiers tend to follow their leaders only as long as they're winning battles. When they start losing, they'll abandon them in an instant. He must have thought that Caesar was going to support him in this endeavor, but he was wrong. Caesar, you see, was still smarting from the rejection that he suffered at the hands of the Senate and the equestrians, and he viewed Pompey's decision to disband his army as a chance to strike a blow against his enemies. Not only did he refuse to intervene in Pompey's behalf, he actually ordered the treasury not to pay the soldiers who had just been discharged. Needless to say, This caused a lot of resentment amongst Pompey's veterans, and it drove a wedge between him and Caesar, a wedge that would never be repaired. With his army gone, Pompey had indeed earned the respect of the Senate. They had been afraid that he would use his army to seize control of Rome. Now that he had disbanded his army, this fear was he was allowed into the city without incident. But this was about the only concession that the Senate would grant him. Pompey may have been popular with the people of Rome, but he was completely isolated in the Senate, and this was a serious problem. He needed allies in the Senate if he wanted to launch another successful campaign, especially since he had alienated Caesar and the equestrian class. With no allies in Rome, Pompey would be a sitting duck if another powerful enemy were to appear. The problem was that he could not exactly go back to the people of Rome and ask them for help. You see, in Roman culture, it was considered undignified for a man to beg for votes from door to door. Instead, the custom was for the voters to come to the candidate and offer their vote freely. So, unless Pompey could find a way to entice the voters to come to him, he was unlikely to find any support. So, what was he to do? The answer. We'll find out in the next episode. But for now, let's just say that his solution was not exactly what the people of Rome were expecting. And if you want to find out how the people of Rome reacted to this unexpected turn of events, then why not start watching season 1 of our series Rome right now? I hope you enjoyed this installment in our series on Pompey the Great. If you did, please show your support. I would love to be able to produce more content like this. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. So at the end of chapter 8, we ended with Pompey being forced out of the city by a rival faction who were trying to exclude him from the government. Now Pompey was able to get himself elected to the consulship, but that was not exactly an ideal solution, because he was now bound by the laws of the Republic and unable to really do anything without a colleague. And the problem was that his colleague was none other than Crassus, the leader of the faction that had tried to keep Pompey out of the city in the first place. So what are they gonna do? Well, as it turns out, they actually managed to form one of the most famous political alliances in Roman history. This is Chapter 9. Caesar has recently come back to Rome after winning a very impressive victory in his Gallic Wars. But when he gets there, he finds out that he has absolutely no friends. See, when Caesar left for Gaul, he had allied himself with a popular tribune named Marcus Junius Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus. In fact, this was the same Marcus Junius Brutus that Cicero had defended in court all those years ago. But while Caesar was off conquering new territories for the Roman people, this Brutus turned on him. He had been secretly working with Pompey and Crassus to get them elected to the consulship, and then passed laws that made it harder for Caesar to get his army discharged. Without that discharge, Caesar couldn't really do much of anything. And then to top it all off, Brutus even made a speech accusing Caesar of being a tyrant and a dictator wannabe. It was a pretty effective strategy, and it worked. Caesar found himself excluded from the Republican power structure, but luckily for him, he had some powerful friends, namely a man named Marcus Licinius. You see, Marcus Licinius Crassus was not only the richest man in Rome, but he was also a former consul, and so he understood how the system worked. And what he quickly realized was that Caesar was going to be a problem for him. If Caesar ever wanted to run for consul again, after all, Caesar was extremely popular with the common folk. If Crassus wanted to be elected consul again, he would need to neutralize this threat. And so he did something kind of crazy. He formed an alliance with Caesar and Pompey, a sort of three-way marriage between the three most powerful men in Rome. Now this alliance would become known as the First Now the original idea behind the Triumvirate was for Caesar to come back to Rome with his army, kick Crassus and Pompey out of the consulship, and then replace them with himself and a friend. That way Caesar could use his consulship to secure his position in Roman society. And at the same time, his army would be stationed in Rome as a sort of insurance policy. Now, This plan required that Pompey support Caesar, and that was never really going to happen. Pompey had just defeated Caesar in the Senate. He wasn't about to let him become his subordinate. And besides, Pompey didn't want to lose the consulship either. So instead, he basically told Caesar to go away. Basically, the alliance that Crassus had hoped for was not going to work. But then something unexpected happened. Pompey's daughter was getting married to Caesar's son, and so to honor this occasion, Pompey decided to invite Caesar to come to the wedding in person. So Caesar showed up to the wedding with a few thousand soldiers. And then while he was there, he met Pompey's daughter Julia, and they fell madly in love with each other. And so, as a reward for hosting such a wonderful wedding, Caesar decided to marry her. And that, right there, is what formed the First Triumvirate. The marriage between Caesar and Julia basically tied the two families together and made it impossible for them to ever fight against each other again. This was actually a pretty standard practice in Roman politics. Powerful families would often use marriage as a way of cementing their control over the state. For example, Augustus later married his stepdaughter, Livia, and she would help him turn the empire into a monarchy. Now, in theory, the marriage between Caesar and Julia should have made Pompey happy. After all, it cemented the alliance between his family and Caesar's. But he wasn't really happy about it. In fact, he hated it. And the reason why was because he was getting overshadowed. See, Pompey had originally been the leader of the faction that had tried to exclude Caesar from the government. But once Caesar married his daughter, it was clear who was really in charge. Now, it was bad enough that Caesar had gotten elected consul, but this marriage basically confirmed that Caesar was here to stay. And so, to make matters worse, Caesar used his influence to push through some legislation that helped him keep his army even after he left the consulship. So not only did he maintain his military power, but he also got himself elected to a position of political power. And worst of all, Pompey didn't really have a choice. He had tried to stop Caesar from marrying his daughter, but he had no choice but to accept it. And this is where things get kind of crazy, because it was Pompey's wife, Julia, who insisted that the two families needed to unite. She was furious with her husband for siding against Caesar, and she refused to accept that he had defeated him. To her, Caesar was still the most popular politician in Rome, and she believed that by marrying into his family, she would be bringing more glory upon her own. So she essentially blackmailed her husband into agreeing to the union. Now, to make matters even more complicated, Julia was actually Julia's grandmother, which meant that she was kind of a part of the reason why Caesar and Pompey had originally become rivals. So it was definitely a bit awkward. In fact, it was so awkward that Pompey actually divorced her shortly after Caesar arrived in Rome. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Caesar and Pompey were now officially tied together, and there was nothing that Pompey could do to escape it. Now, technically, the First Triumvirate wasn't supposed to be an alliance, and that's probably why it fell apart so quickly. They weren't supposed to rule together or share any power. It was just an agreement that they wouldn't get in each other's way. But it didn't really work out like that. As soon as Caesar got married to Julia, he was able to get himself elected to a very powerful position called the tribunus. Now, this office was normally held by a plebeian, someone from the lower class. But Caesar was able to convince the assembly to elect him because he was so popular, and that meant that he could block any legislation that was harmful to the plebs. But it also gave him the opportunity to pass legislation that benefited them, which he did, and that naturally pissed off the elites. They were already annoyed that Caesar had taken over the government from their guy Crassus, and now he was passing laws that were favorable to the common folk, and so they tried to get rid of him. The Senate actually voted to remove him from his office, but that failed because Pompey stepped in and defended him. The elites realized that they couldn't get rid of Caesar, so they tried to get rid of Pompey instead. They accused him of accepting bribes in order to grant Roman citizenship to the people of one of their allies. And that was bad. You weren't supposed to accept bribes as a magistrate, and it was especially bad if you did it while you were leading an investigation into your own past actions. But they couldn't prove anything, and ultimately the charges were dropped. And then right after that, Caesar got elected as Pontifex Maximus, which gave him even more power. Basically, the Senate tried everything they could to get rid of Caesar, but it didn't work because he was backed by the most powerful man in Rome, Pompey. And that was kind of the problem. The First Triumvirate wasn't supposed to be an alliance. It was just supposed to be a marriage between two families. But Caesar and Pompey didn't know how to stop it from becoming something more. You see, Neither one of these guys was very good at hiding their ambition. They both wanted to be the most powerful man in Rome, and they both thought that they deserved it, but they couldn't figure out how to share the power. And so the First Triumvirate would collapse just 8 years later during the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. But that's a story for another time. Alright everyone, that's the end of chapter 9. Next chapter, we're going to look at the assassination of Caesar and the rise of Augustus. So if you'd like to see that, please subscribe and come back on Thursday. Also, if you want to watch the next chapter early or get exclusive content, consider becoming a member on our website. Our website also hosts many other great historical tales, so please check that out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Chapter 10. Fractures in the Alliance. The year is 54 BCE. Julius Caesar is in the middle of his first consulship. This will be an important year for him. He'll have to stand for re-election to the consulship, which he needs to do from his province in Gaul. But more importantly, this is when he will marry Cleopatra. But before we get there, let's recap what happened in the last episode. We left off with Mark Antony having just defeated the Helvetians. With the help of Caesar's cavalry, the Roman Senate was furious about it, and even more furious when they found out that Caesar had taken credit for the victory. The elders called for a vote to determine if Antony should keep his command. Antony pleaded his case to the tribes directly. Crassus decided to take his own life, rather than defend himself in front of the Roman mob, and Cicero made a subtle dig at Caesar. All of this resulted in Antony keeping his command. But it's becoming clear that all is not well within the alliance. Subtle cracks are beginning to form between Caesar and Pompey. In 54 BCE, Caesar will lose his father-in-law and one of his most valuable allies in the Senate. Metellus. That's right. The one who gave him his daughter Julia to marry. Well, her death has everything to do with why I'm filming this series in the first place. I mean, her death set off the entire chain of events. So let's get caught up on what happened to her. Julia had been married to Caesar for 9 years, but they hadn't spent much time together. During their marriage, she traveled back and forth between Rome and her father's estate in further Spain. In 60 BCE, while traveling through southern France, she met her end at the age of 25. What killed her? Historians aren't sure. Plutarch writes that it was childbirth, but other historians disagree. Appian says she died due to complications from breast cancer, and Suetonius claims it was an overdose from an abortion pill. Either way, she was pregnant at some point. And not pregnant when she died. Maybe you could make a whole episode about Julia's various pregnancies and but that's not the point of today's episode. While Julia's death is tragic, Caesar wasn't alone in his grief. In fact, he was in good company. Crassus also lost someone very important to him around the same time, his son, Publius. It makes sense why Crassus would be upset. His son had been betrothed to Caesar's daughter. But what happened to the engagement? Unfortunately for us, historians don't know. Here's what we do know. Shortly after losing a son, Crassus traveled east to take command of his new province, Syria. There he raised an army and set his sights on defeating the Parthians once and for all. When his troops reached the city of Carrhae in the winter of 53 BCE, they were met by a Parthian army twice its size. Crassus wanted to wait until spring to fight, but his subordinate, the tribune Gaius, Cassius Longinus, insisted on fighting immediately. Cassius thought he could win quickly and move on to plundering the rest of the Near East. Apparently, he didn't consider the odds of their army being surrounded by vastly superior numbers. Whatever the reason, Crassus allowed the battle to take place. From the moment the battle began, it was clear that the Romans were in trouble. Their cavalry was routed almost immediately. Crassus and Cassius then tried to rally the infantry, but even that didn't work. Soon, they were fighting separately. At some point during the chaos, Crassus was killed. According to Plutarch, he was killed by Parthian cavalrymen who rode up to him and asked for his gold ring. When he refused to give it up, they cut off his finger instead. If Plutarch's story is true, it was probably a bit embarrassing for the Roman general. Imagine dying because some horse-mounted nomads wanted your bling. Other accounts say he was killed in more conventional fashion, like maybe by arrows or swords. Either way, the Roman army was completely destroyed. Thousands were killed, including Cassius. Only a few thousand survived and retreated into the hills. Crassus's head and the severed finger with the gold ring were sent to Attila, the king of Parthia, who was apparently a fan of Roman bling. News of the disaster in Caria reached Rome in the late spring of 53, just as Lentulus was wrapping up his consulship. Like the elders, Lentulus had no love for Caesar, so he did everything he could to hurt him. That meant publicizing news of the defeat in Caria and blaming Caesar for it. What did Caesar do? He hit back. He criticized Lentulus for wasting money on luxuries and sacrificing the Republic's safety. Caesar claimed that Lentulus was unfocused on his duties and instead spent his time running prostitutes in taverns, brothels, and bathhouses. As proof, he brought forward two senators, Marcus Callidius and Lucius Callius Rufus, who accused Lentulus of having a sexual relationship with a young male prostitute named. Those accusations were enough to get Lentulus exiled from the city of Rome. While Lentulus eventually returned from exile, he would never again hold an important political office. In the eyes of the Roman people, Caesar came out on top in this little public spat. But the damage to his relationship with the Optimates was done. They viewed his decision to marry Cleopatra as a sign that he was ready to destroy the Republic. But before we get to that, we need to figure out where Pompey stands. On the one hand, Pompey hated Caesar and would jump at the chance to destroy him. But he also needed Caesar as an ally. That's because Pompey was still paying for the massive fleet he used to defeat the pirates. Not only that, but he was already planning another war, this time against the kingdom of Pontus in the Black Sea region. Sure, he could pay for it all himself, but why do that when Caesar's money was essentially free? I mean, Caesar wouldn't mind spending money to get rid of Pompey. So as much as Pompey hated Caesar, he probably stayed out of the conflict. That might be a relief for Caesar, but it didn't last long. A few months later, Pompey began taking actions that showed his allegiance was with the First, he sided with Q. Caecilius, Metellus Pius, against Gaius Marius the Younger over the distribution of spoils of war. He also opposed Gaius Norbanus, who was close to Caesar, in the election for consul, and he even voted against Publius Vatinius, who was another ally of Caesar. To make matters worse, he began campaigning against pirates in the Aegean Sea, which was extremely close to where Sextus Pompey was operating. Everyone understood what was happening. Pompey was subtly sabotaging Caesar's brother-in-law. That might not seem like a big deal now, but at the time, Sextus Pompey was extremely powerful. I mean, he controlled the seas around Italy and threatened Rome itself. Only Caesar defeated him in the civil war that followed. What else did Pompey do to rub Caesar the wrong way? Well, for starters, he adopted the traditional white toga of a magistrate, which had previously been worn only by high priests. Then he went out of his way to perform traditional rituals, like sacrificing a bull with a wooden knife. And finally, he sided with the Optimates in the Catiline conspiracy. If Caesar noticed the subtle jabs from Pompey, he didn't respond. The two men maintained a friendly, public relationship. But how close were they really? Maybe the two were never friends in the first place. Plutarch claims that Pompey and Caesar initially formed an alliance based solely on Caesar needed Pompey's influence with the elites, and Pompey needed Caesar's support to acquire the dictatorship. Once they got what they needed, they became rivals. You can see that rivalry in their body language. Notice how Caesar always stands behind Pompey in statues and paintings. Even when they stand next to each other, their shoulders aren't even parallel. You can tell who's more important by where they stand. Caesar's relationship with the elder Pompey was doomed from the start. But what about the younger Pompey? Maybe you can salvage that one. To learn how that relationship turned into one of ancient Rome's greatest rivalries, stay tuned for episode 11, The Young and the Restless. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. If you want to see more episodes like this, please subscribe. See you next time. Well, hello there, and welcome back to my channel. In Chapter 10, we saw that Caesar's presence at Rome was unexactly welcomed by the Senate, and that they tried to get rid of him by having him recalled from his Gallic province. But when he refused to leave, the Senate ordered him to relinquish his command. So in this, our 11th episode, we will see what happens next, as the Republic marches ever closer towards civil war. But before we begin, if you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing. You know how YouTube is, and it helps me out a lot if you take just 2 seconds to do that. And while you're at it, why not also ring that bell for notifications? Because you'll get to hear about new episodes the moment that they come out. Thank you very much for your support. Now then, let's get on with the story. As well as so, Caesar was in northern Italy with his army, having just defeated the Helvetians. And with all of Gaul at his mercy, he could have easily spent the rest of his allotted term in Gaul, pacifying the other tribes there and then returned to Rome as a conquering hero. But no, the Senate wouldn't allow that. They ordered him to return home without his army and to leave his lieutenant, Curio, in charge of all of those legions. But Caesar knew that the Senate would never allow him to keep his command if he followed their orders. Therefore, he had to make a decision. Either side with the Senate and abandon his army, or stand firm and risk civil war. And as far as we can tell, he didn't really hesitate at all, though whether that was because he wanted to cling on to power or because he had no intention of obeying the Senate in the first place is another matter entirely. In any case, his answer was clear. No, he would not disband his army. He would hold on to his command, and if the Senate did not like it, well, that was their problem. So what happened next? Well, it turns out that while Caesar was making up his mind, Pompey, who was now the sole consul for the year, 58 BCE had come down from the north and was in Etruria waiting to see what Caesar would do. Pompey was sort of in an awkward position. Ever since that incident with the assassins a couple of years earlier, he had been more or less on Caesar's side. But this whole affair with the recall had put him on the opposite side to his old ally and friend. It seemed that there was nothing to be done but to choose sides. And while he might have preferred to remain neutral, it seems that he decided to side with the Senate, and basically told Caesar to shove it. Now, even though Pompey was only consul for another month, normally a consul could raise an army in the name of the state and call upon other Italian states to join his cause. However, because Pompey was so closely associated with Caesar, most of the Italian states stuck with Caesar, which left Pompey with a force of only 20 cohorts, about 5,000 men. So the die was cast. The stage was set. There was no turning back. And so with his small force, Pompey marched northwards towards Caesar, hoping to convince him to come to his senses and agree to the Senate's demands. But it was too late. On New Year's Day in 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with 10 of his legions and marched on Rome. This day is famous as the point of no return, the moment when the Republic tipped over into civil war. Pompey was thus forced to flee south to Greece with a handful of cohorts. Caesar soon entered northern Italy, where he had to deal with a few revolts by disaffected generals, but none of them amounted to anything serious. Eventually, he reached the plains of the farther with his army intact, and pretty much no opposition at all. And so in 48 BCE, he returned to Rome as master of the western provinces, an undisputed dictator, having made himself virtually sole ruler of the entire Mediterranean world. That is, except for Pompey, who was still hanging on in Greece with 3 legions and the title of sole consul. But for how long? Meanwhile, in Rome, Octavian and Agrippa were getting things organized, mostly by seizing property from Caesar's enemies and distributing it amongst their supporters. Soon after Caesar arrived back in Rome, the Senate formally declared him a public enemy and gave Pompey the authority to raise an army to fight against him. At the same time, though, they also sent ambassadors to try to negotiate a settlement with Caesar, who turned them away without even letting them enter his court. Caesar spent the rest of the year 48 BCE, consolidating his power in the west, campaigning in Spain and putting down a revolt in Africa led by Sextus Pompey, who was Pompey the Great's brother. Meanwhile, Pompey was raising his army in Greece, though whether he raised 3 new legions or reinforced the ones that he already had, accounts disagree. We do know that he was eventually left with 4 legions, though some accounts claim that they were all raised by other generals and only joined Pompey later on. By early 47 BCE, Caesar had finished dealing with the revolts and was ready to move east and deal with Pompey. Before doing so, however, he needed to secure Italy and so appointed his friend and fellow general, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, to govern the Italian peninsula. In 46, Caesar moved east to meet Pompey, bringing with him 2 of the legions he had in Spain under the command of his son-in-law, the aforementioned Marcus Junius Brutus, and 1 of the legions he had in Africa under Titus Labienus. Along the way, he relieved the siege of a city called Massilia, which had been besieged by Sextus Pompey, and destroyed part of his fleet. We are unsure if Caesar intended to conquer all of the eastern provinces himself, or if he planned to appoint someone else to govern them, though some modern scholars believe that he intended to appoint Lepidus, who had shown himself capable of governing the unruly Italian peninsula. In any case, his plans came to nothing because Sextus Pompey fled to Asia Minor, leaving Pompey the Great to face Caesar alone. The two met near Pharsalus in Greece, where after a brief battle, Pompey lost and was forced to flee once more, this time to Egypt. Some accounts say that Pompey was tricked into coming to Egypt, believing that the Egyptian king, Ptolemy XIII, was actually a friend of Caesar and would protect him. Whatever the truth, Pompey arrived in Alexandria and asked for asylum, only to be murdered at the behest of Caesar soon afterwards. His head was cut off and sent to Caesar, who received it with mixed feelings, according to Plutarch. Caesar was angry that Pompey had been murdered and mourned the passing of his former friend, but at the same time, he also felt a sense of relief as he had finally defeated his rival once and for all. With his greatest rival dead, Caesar consolidated his control over the eastern provinces and began to reform the state as he saw fit. One of his first acts was to change the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, which remained in use until the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century CE. And that is where we will leave off for today, next time. We will look at the aftermath of Caesar's victory and the lead-up to the civil war between Caesar and the Second Triumvirate. But for now, that is where we will leave it. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. And until next time, Veil. This is a battle for the history books. 2 great generals, 2 mighty armies, 1 decisive day. This is the Battle of Pharsalus, Chapter 12. So Caesar has just landed in Greece with 4 legions and some cavalry. And we start our story in the port city of Demetrius, because that is where Pompey is staying right now. He's got 21 legions and a bunch of allied troops, so it's like 80,000 men versus 40,000. But don't worry about that, because Pompey doesn't want to fight. Let me explain. You see, Pompey's bigger problem is not that he's facing the great Julius Caesar, though that's not ideal. His biggest problem is actually the civil war he's waging is deeply unpopular. Even though he was named dictator, he's had to raise armies by force, conscripting unwilling men into service. These troops are not exactly dying to go out and fight Caesar, but Pompey knows if he doesn't do something soon, Rome will fall to Caesar and there'll be no turning back. So he's got to win a battle, but against his better judgment, he's picked this place. Pharsalus. It's here because this plain is flat and open, which plays right into Caesar's strengths. Pompeius's scouts tell him this, but he ignores them. And then when Caesar does arrive, he sets up camp and does nothing. So Caesar gets impatient and sends out some cavalry to harass Pompey's forces. They have a little skirmish and both sides claim victory. Then they break camp and march away. So Pompey decides, you know what? Let's chase them. Let's get us a battle. He pursues Caesar and his troops and catches up with them at the river But even despite having twice as many men, Pompey doesn't attack. Instead, he lets Caesar cross the river and set up camp again, just 5 miles from Pharsalus. Now, because the ground here is so open, most military historians agree, Caesar probably deployed his legions in a rectangle around the center of the camp. This is called a double convex or a double Dyson. It's strong in the middle, but weak around the edges. You deploy it when you expect an attack from the front. But guess what? You can't reinforce the flanks. Pompey knows this. He should attack, but he's afraid. See, Caesar's reputation as a great general is well deserved. Like sure, he lost at the Battle of the River, but he won at the battles of the Achaeus, Phereus and Gergovia, defeating powerful armies in each one. But really, Pompey doesn't have to defeat Caesar. All he has to do is match him, stand toe-to-toe and hope for a lucky break. That's all he needs to win the day. But still, he's afraid. Perhaps he's worried about being too close to his enemy, of seeing their tactics and strategies, of knowing how strong his opponent is. Or maybe he is concerned about being trapped by the same sort of terrain that allowed Caesar to trap him here. Whatever the reason, he waits. He sits on his hands for 4 whole days. During that time, deserters trickle into Caesar's camp. So may be choice, because their commanders forced them. By the end of the 4th day, 3 entire legions are defecting to Caesar. Now, that's more than enough for Caesar to win this battle. But he doesn't know it, and so he spends those days training his men, drilling them in new maneuvers, readying them for battle. Meanwhile, Pompey's army grows restless. They've been ordered to attack, but they're getting nervous. They don't want to charge across that plain into the teeth of the enemy, so they talk amongst themselves, whispering in hushed tones, wondering why they haven't been given the order. Some of them think Pompey is crazy. They say he's fallen under the evil eye of Cleopatra, that she's put a spell on him and paralyzed him with fear. Oh, there's Sino. It's the ghost of Cato, another great Roman general who lost to Caesar at the Battle of Thapsi. Cato's ghost has come back to warn Pompey of what's to come. Either way, nobody wants to go into battle. Finally, on the 5th day, the order comes. Attack tomorrow. So the next morning, before sunrise, while Caesar's holding a conference with his officers, Pompey's army gets up and starts marching. They move 3 miles down the road towards Pharsalus, then stop and wait. Nothing happens. Still, no orders. So they begin moving forward again, this time 2 miles, until they reach a small farmhouse. Here, Pompey stops his advance and watches what happens. Meanwhile, Caesar finishes his meeting. He marshes his men out of camp, lines them up on the edge of the wood, and says, "Prepare to defend the position," then runs back to the safety of the tents to grab his armor. And when he comes back, the battle is already joined. Pompey's cavalry charges across the plain, driving back Caesar's light infantry, who quickly fall back behind the main line. When Caesar sees this, he knows he's in trouble. His men aren't ready. They haven't formed a line, so he shouts for them to form up along the edge of the trees. As the cavalry charges by, they have to hurry, but they get into position just in time. Pompey's infantry, 7,000 strong, charges across the plain, hitting the Roman legion head-on. They collide in the center of the field. It's hard fighting, but the Romans hold their ground, and when Caesar finally arrives on the field, he sees an opportunity. He sends reinforcements to shore up the middle of his line. He tells the other legions to fan out and attack the flanks. Then he leads a personal assault on Pompey's center. Fighting all around, the legions clash. Shields are smashed, swords are drawn, men are hacked to pieces. And as the battle rages, Caesar moves from right to left, wherever the fighting is fiercest, boosting morale, lending a hand. Whenever his men falter, he steps in to deliver a speech, rallying them to victory. Finally, after an hour of fighting, the Roman discipline and numbers begin to tell. Caesar's men break through the center and push Pompey's legions back. They flee to the hills, chasing them the whole way. Caesar's cavalry swoops down from the north, cutting off any retreat. Most of Pompey's cavalrymen flee to the hills, but a few hundred stay behind. They gallop across the field, trying to keep their distance from the Romans, firing arrows into their ranks. Caesar's cavalry charges them. Many are killed, but some get away. The battle is over. Caesar wins. He loses those 1,000 men, but Pompey loses at least 6,000, maybe much more. So afterward, Caesar gives a magnificent feast to celebrate the victory, but he doesn't find Pompey. You see, the night before the battle, Pompey's wife, Cornelia, sneaks into Caesar's camp and warns him, "If you kill my husband, you'll be killing your own family member. We're related. If you take him alive, I promise you, my father-in-law will give you half of his fortune." So Caesar vows to capture him alive. But once the battle is done, he finds only a wounded horse. Pompey has fled, taking his fortune and his life with him, and this would be bad news for Caesar if he wasn't planning on chasing him down. So that's what he does. He sets out after Pompey, catching up with him at the city of Athens. There, Pompey is arrested, sent to Rome as a prisoner, and then executed on the orders of, you guessed it, Cornelia. Talk about a family affair. And so that is the end of chapter 12. I hope you enjoyed these tales of ancient warfare. I'm the host. If you want to know more about the ancient world, check out my channel and remember to subscribe. Thanks for watching. This is the story of Rome's greatest general, brought to you by Audible. Chapter 13. Flight and Betrayal. The Roman world was a dangerous place for an ambitious man. Even the mighty Pompey had learned that lesson the hard way, reduced to seeking sanctuary with the Pharaoh of Egypt rather than facing the might of his former friend, Caesar. What hospitality he would receive in Alexandria, though, was something even Pompey hadn't anticipated. Arriving there in the autumn of 48 BC, Pompey's fleet sailed into the harbor just after sunset. It was a grand sight to behold. Hundreds of ships crowding the shore, their banners snapping in the wind like some great predatory bird readying itself to strike. But the prey that awaited them in this instance was not Rome, but rather its fallen hero. Pompey had sent word ahead that he was coming, and so King Ptolemy XIII had come down to the docks to meet him, or at least to meet his delegation. His welcome was warm enough. Egave Pompey, esmen lantu campon, and even ordered his palace, prepared to house the general and his family. But those good graces were quickly exhausted. As soon as Pompey arrived, Ptolemy shut him out of his palace and refused him entry. He said it wasn't his fault. His mother, Cleopatra, wouldn't allow it. She didn't want her son giving offense to Caesar. It was all very confusing. Pompey should have been flattered, no doubt, to be treated this way for Caesar's sake, except he was too busy looking for a way out. It was obvious now that Alexandria wasn't going to be a safe haven from Caesar. All the king's promises of hospitality and friendship were nothing but lies. So while Ptolemy fawned over him and welcomed him to his city, secretly he was preparing to murder him. But before we get into how Pompey met his demise, if you're enjoying this series, please make sure you subscribe and leave a review. Reviews really help us out. And now back to the story. Pompey eventually realized what was happening, and he tried to flee to the temple of the Egyptian goddess Isis. But when he got there, he found it guarded by armed men, also at the king's orders. Then he tried to escape across the desert to the east, where Caesar was rumored to be. But he was intercepted there by a massive force of cavalry and infantry. They drove him back to the city. Pompey then fled to the shore of Pelusium, where he hoped his ships could protect him. There he sent messengers to the Roman governor of Cyprus, hoping to buy time to escape to Asia. But Ptolemy was quicker than Pompey. He hired 2 assassins and had them smuggled onto the beach under the cover of darkness. Then, just as Pompey was about to board his ship and sail away, they jumped him. Pompey put up a fight. His bodyguard hacked one assassin to pieces, but the other managed to get close enough to deal a killing blow. He plunged his dagger deep into Pompey's neck, severing his carotid artery. Blood poured out of the wound and ran down his breastplate. The assassins thought he was dead and ran off, but Pompey survived long enough to stumble onto a ship. It was the Siren, captained by the shrewd Bithynian Aris. The captain helped Pompey aboard and immediately set sail for the open water. Ptolemy had won. Caesar's greatest rival was dead, slain on his own soil. The assassins were caught and executed, but they didn't care. They had done what they were hired for. King Ptolemy thought he had played both sides of the fence well, showing respect to Caesar while murdering Pompey. But he was wrong. Caesar was furious that such a great general as Pompey had met such a dishonorable end. When he heard the news, he fell to his knees and lamented the passing of his old friend, and that was nothing compared to what happened when he saw Pompey's severed head. When his fleet arrived in Alexandria, the first thing he did was demand that Pompey's head be brought before him. He wanted to pay his respects to his friend and rival, and who could blame him? The 2 men had fought together against the sons of Sulla. They had led Rome to victory in the civil war against the Marians. They had defeated the pirates of the Mediterranean. Together, they had made themselves masters of the Roman world. And yet, here was Pompey's head, proof that even the mightiest of Romans was mortal. Caesar looked at his old friend's face, taking in every detail, every wrinkle, every scar. He noticed the ashen hue of his skin, the lifeless stare of his eyes. This was not the face of a god. This was the face of a man who had loved, who had laughed, who had lived, and now was dead. He felt no joy at the sight, no elation at having won their struggle. Only sorrow. As he stood there staring at his old friend's head, he knew he had failed both himself and Rome. The Republic was gone. Now only the Empire remained. And so when Caesar left for Rome, he took Pompey's head with him, along with the body of his murdered friend. Brutus. Both men deserved a proper burial, even if the living had failed them. In Rome, the people mourned Pompey. Even Cicero acknowledged that he had been a good general and true patriot, saying, "I lament not the death of Pompey, but that the Senate has lost its head." As for Ptolemy, he thought he had got away with murder, but he was wrong. When Caesar arrived in Rome, he went straight to the palace of Pompey and moved in. Some said he did it to rub salt in Ptolemy's wounds, but there may have been another reason. By staying in Pompey's house, Caesar was sending a message to the entire Roman world. He was saying that Pompey's job was finished, but his own was just beginning. He spent much of the next year consolidating his power. He crushed rebellions in Gaul and Germany. He sent new governors to the provinces. He reformed the calendar, and all the time, Pompey's ghost seemed to linger over him. Early in 47 BC, he dedicated a temple to the deified Pompey, a gesture that stunned the populace of Rome, who had been mourning him for months. But Caesar was serious. He wanted the people to remember that he was not Pompey, but Julius Caesar, that he would lead Rome in a new direction. And so, he spent his last summer surveying the countryside near his house in the Subiaco, planning the conquest of new territories. He had become the master of Rome, but his ambitions were far from finished. One day while he was walking through the fields, he came across a farmer tilling the soil. Caesar stopped and watched him work. The man was sweating, straining under the weight of his task, and suddenly Caesar remembered what it was like to be a farmer, a small landowner in debt, trying to feed his family. It had been so long since he'd thought about that life, but it was never far from his mind. And now as he stood there watching this farmer, he decided to do something drastic. He marched into the nearest city and began buying up farms. He bought up so many farms, in fact, that he became the largest landowner in Italy. That way, no Italian farmer would ever have to worry about debt or hunger again. Caesar was taking care of them, and so he continued working, conquering new lands, reforming old laws, building new roads, expanding the empire. All the time, the memory of Pompey seemed to fade from his mind. He was busy making his own destiny. He had beaten Pompey, but he had also inherited his friend's mantle. Caesar was creating a new kind of Roman, one who was not bound by birthright or wealth, but by merit and ambition. He was making Rome into a meritocracy, a government based on the idea that everyone had a chance to succeed, regardless of their background. That was why he was so popular with the common people. They saw in him a leader who understood their struggles, who cared about their welfare. They also saw in him a strong leader who could protect them from their enemies, and who could blame them for wanting a strong leader. After all, they had just come through a decade of civil war and bloodshed. They wanted peace, stability, prosperity, and Caesar promised them that. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Ptolemy the 13th ruled like a god over his people. He built new temples, made lavish offerings to the gods, hosted great feasts in the palace. He was living the life of a pharaoh, except he was always looking over his shoulder, waiting for Caesar to arrive and take his crown. In the end, it happened just like he feared. Caesar invaded Egypt in 47 BC. He dethroned Ptolemy and forced him to commit suicide. Then he placed Cleopatra on the throne and made himself her lover. But that's a story best left for another time. For now, though, we can say that Caesar had conquered Egypt and added it to his growing empire. He had avenged Pompey's death and secured his own position as master of Rome. He was at the height of his power, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. So he decided to spend his last days doing what he did best, making plans for the future. He gathered his closest friends and confidants and told them his thoughts. He wanted to conquer the East, he said, to bring all of the Mediterranean under Roman rule. He wanted to build new cities, establish trade routes, create a Pax Romana. His friends listened intently, knowing that this was their leader's last chance to explain his vision for the future. Caesar laid out his plans, outlining the military campaigns, economic reforms, and cultural exchanges that would make it happen. And then he turned to his most trusted advisor, Mark Antony, and entrusted him with carrying out his will. "If anything should happen to me," he said, "you must see that these plans are carried out." Antony promised to do everything in his power to make Caesar's dream a reality, and then Caesar died. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Story of Pompey, brought to you by Audible. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. So it's the end of part 2. It's time for some conclusions. So let's do this. We've been looking at military geniuses before. Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar. But today is special because today we have to judge one of our own. This is chapter 14, Legacy of Pompey the Great. It's not so much that Pompey made mistakes. He just kept making a series of bad decisions like dominoes falling after someone nudged him over. And all you need to know about who knocked those dominoes over is this. His father died when he was 20, leaving him in charge of the family's financial security, a family that had been loyal to Sulla, by the way. And now, Sulla was a dictator. So what does young Pompey do? Takes himself to court to get himself declared an adult, so he can take over his inheritance. In other words, even in his youth, he chose cleverness over principle. And that was always going to be a problem for Pompey because his greatest strength was his ability to size up his situation, figure out what decision would best serve his interest, and make it happen. Now, don't get me wrong. That's an amazing trait when it comes to politics or business. Not so much when it comes to war. When Caesar said "Vi victis," when he crossed the Rubicon and marched on Rome, when Ace single-handedly created the modern world, he did it based on boldness and daring and imagination. Pompey didn't do anything like that. He didn't seize power. He didn't take advantage of weakness. He didn't create. He took what he could get. That's opportunism. True power comes from creating opportunities. Pompey was an opportunist. He was willing to make deals with anyone for any reason, even if it meant stabbing someone in the back. And yes, he did stab people in the back. We saw him do it to that merchant ship captain whose life he spared only to plunder his ship and then kill him when he tried to thank Pompey for his generosity. We watched him refuse to help the Roman general advancing into Greece because doing nothing would put him in a better negotiating position with the victorious Mithridates. Then he sold that same general down the river to get support against Caesar. He promised land to those people only to go back on his word. But maybe he had excuses. Maybe he inherited a lot of baggage from his famous father, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who had achieved great things but also committed atrocities. Maybe growing up around that affected him. He was brilliant as a general. We talked about his victories in detail, but even his victories were tainted. He slaughtered unarmed prisoners, and he crucified people simply because they were suspected of disloyalty. His legions weren't fighting for Rome or for Caesar or for any ideal. They were fighting for Pompey, and he could use that devotion however he wanted. He did have principles, though. He wasn't corrupt, and he wasn't venal. He really did disband his troops when he returned to Rome, and he left the province of Asia and its treasure intact. And he did govern Rome fairly and reasonably well. But that's beside the point. That doesn't explain why he couldn't stick to principles instead of playing politics. Why did he hide behind Marcus Crassus? When Marcus Crassus was being investigated for corruption, why did he accept a rigged election rather than campaign against his uncle, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius? Why didn't he seize control of Rome when Marius was marching on the city, or when Sulla seized control and prescribed people at will? Pompey refused to join Sulla in seizing property from the prescribed, which was good. But when Sulla passed a law giving him powers of a tribune of the people, Pompey used that power to enrich himself. Why did he keep getting sucked into these situations? Well, for one thing, because he could easily manipulate most people. Remember, his father was a famous general. He grew up in luxury. He knew how to dress, how to speak, how to move. He was handsome and charismatic. He looked and sounded like a leader. And he acted like one too, at least at first. We saw him take command of a collapsing situation and turn it around against the pirates. We watched him raise an army without breaking the laws, win battles, rescue Roman citizens, collect treasure, sail across the Mediterranean, take prisoners, show mercy, and finally arrive home with all the glory and credit due him. That was pure leadership. But then he started acting like a politician, slicing up spoils, making deals, taking advice from others, pretending to be friends with Caesar while planning to destroy him. There was no imagination. There was no vision. There was no boldness. He was afraid to be the first. All he wanted was to get ahead of everyone else and share in the spoils. And todo that he was willing to play the long game. Wait, buy this time, prepare. He campaigned in the east and won more victories and gained more glory. And all the time he was waiting for Caesar to exhaust himself, waiting for the Senate to tire of Caesar, waiting for the moment when he could come back to Rome and grab power for himself. Except it never happened. See, here's the thing about opportunism. You're always stuck waiting for things to break your way. You're always dependent on outside circumstances. And if you're not careful, those circumstances can turn against you. So you see, the whole story of Pompey isn't really about military genius. It's about seizing opportunities, personal opportunities, political opportunities. If he'd been willing to create his own opportunities, if he'd dared to dream big dreams, if he'd had the imagination to create something new, he might have succeeded. Instead, he clung to past glories and tried to ride the coattails of past victories. And in the end, he paid the price. The last thing we have to ask ourselves is why Rome didn't learn from this. We saw Caesar create new opportunities, new possibilities for Rome. He broke the laws and he bent the customs and he defied tradition, and he did it to strengthen Rome and its people. Pompey would have none of that. He wanted to be a traditional Roman, to honor the laws and customs and traditions. He didn't want to be like his father, who had broken the laws to get ahead, who had used violence and intimidation to achieve success. Yet here's the thing, his father had done it because he had a vision for Rome. He thought he was strengthening Rome by limiting the power of the populares and by crushing the Marian reforms. But by sticking so closely to tradition, by trying so hard to be a traditional Roman, Pompey failed to understand that Rome was changing. He was like an old man clinging to the ways of the past, unable to adapt to the new realities of the present. So Caesar got the crown and Pompey got the statue. But both were destined to fail because neither knew where Rome was going. Both failed because neither understood the lessons of history. Pompey was a product of the Republic, and he tried to save the Republic. But he couldn't see that the Republic was already dead. And Caesar, he was a product of the old world, but he had the vision of the new one. And the irony is that both men died believing they'd accomplished something significant, but neither did. Caesar fell and Rome burned and Octavian won. When Augustus came to power, he understood that the old Republic was gone forever. He called the old institutions into existence one last time, but then he ignored them. He set out to build a new Rome, a Rome of order and peace and prosperity. He moved the capital to a new city. He reorganized the entire government. He established a new dynasty. He built monuments and temples and roads and aqueducts and public works. He set up local governments. He reformed the military. He expanded the empire. But he didn't crush the Senate. He didn't ignore the old customs and traditions. He integrated them into a new system, a system that lasted for centuries. He understood the lessons of history, and in doing so, he changed the course of civilization. As for Pompey, well, he's just a footnote in the footnotes of history. He's the perfect example of why Clausewitz's dictum about passion trumping reason holds true. He was brilliant enough to understand the necessity of having principles, but he wasn't passionate enough to live by them. He was smart enough to recognize the difference between strength and weakness, but he wasn't bold enough to exploit them. He knew the difference between right and wrong, but he wasn't courageous enough to choose right. That's it for this series on military genius. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like. If you didn't, well, tell me how I can do better. And remember, some people call me a military genius. I call myself a servant of the Medici. We are coming now to the end of our narrative, to the final page of this strange and wonderful book, to the last embers of Pompey's pyre. And so it is fitting that we bring our story up into the hills above Rome, up here where we can see the stars and reflect on what we have seen and learned. I want to say first that even though our hero's fate was sealed long ago, even though his doom was decreed by forces beyond his control, Do not think for a moment that Pompey's life was a tragedy. Do not for a moment believe that he was a victim of some great cosmic injustice. He lived a full life. He saw more than his share of glory. He tasted power, commanded armies, led nations, and in the end, died on the field of battle with honor. He was a Roman, after all. Could anything else have been expected? Life is a mixed bag of good fortune and bad, victory and defeat, feast or famine, sunshine and storms. All of these things are inevitable and necessary. We need the dark to know the light, the quiet to appreciate the song. You cannot tell me that the sweet taste of strawberries would be as welcome if it were not for the bitter tang of lemons, or that laughter would ring so true if every hour of every day were given over to mirth. The gods themselves took care to balance the scales. They gave Caesar a flaw, you will remember, making him overambitious and quick to anger, but also generous and brave. They gave Pompey a tendency to trust others too much and a weakness for procrastination, but also an honest heart and a sure hand in battle. Life is like this. It must always be this way. There is no other way. Nothing worth having comes without its price. This is why life is a challenge, and this is why it is so interesting. What matters in the end is how you respond, how you handle the blows of fate, how you respond to ambition or jealousy or fear, how you react to the opportunities that come your way. These are the things that matter, and these are the things that make men and women into heroes or villains. Pompeius Magnus did not lack for opportunity, nor did he lack for challenges. If anything, he had more than his share of both. What he lacked, it seems, was the ability or perhaps the desire to learn from his experiences, and this was his undoing, his inability to grow, to change, to adapt, and overcome. This was the thing that kept him forever, a step behind his rivals. And this, I am afraid, is something that all of us can recognize. And yet, despite this failing, despite the fact that Pompey made the same mistakes again and again, we cannot help but admire him, can we? Because we see ourselves in him. We see in him the potential that we all have, the potential for greatness, yes, but also the potential for self-sabotage. We see in him our own failings, our own fears. We see our own capacity for love and loyalty and bravery. We see our own ability to be honorable and just and merciful when dealing with those who are less fortunate than ourselves. We see our ability to be selfish, petty, vindictive, and cruel. We see in him our better angels and our darker demons. We see ourselves. We see our fellow human beings. It is why we tell stories. Stories are important. They teach us lessons. They entertain us. But most importantly of all, they remind us that we are not alone. They remind us that the people around us, our friends and neighbors, our rivals and enemies, they are not so very different from us. Beneath their fine clothes and their fancy chariots, beneath their armor and their helmets, they are not so very different from us. They are not so very different from you. They are not so very different from me. They are not so very different from Caesar. They are not so very different from Pompey. They are not so very different from any of us. We are all alike in many ways. We are all driven by the same hopes and dreams and fears and failings. This is why the story of Caesar and Pompey is important, because it reminds us that we are all mortal. It reminds us that no matter how powerful we might become, no matter how brilliant or talented we might be, no matter how much gold we possess or how large our armies are, in the end we will all meet the same fate. We will all return to the dust from which we came. We will all feed the worms. We will all leave this world a little poorer, a little emptier for our having been here. It is our common fate. It is our destiny. As the sun sinks down over the hills, look out over the fields and the valleys and the plains. See the waves of the Mediterranean sparkling in the last rays of daylight. Hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle, the buzzing of insects and the croaking of frogs. Smell the sweet blossoms of the laurel and the myrtle and the bay. Taste the warm evening air, heavy with the scent of oranges and lemons. Feel the soft earth beneath your feet and the gentle breeze upon your skin. Open your eyes and take it all in, for you will not be here for long. Open your ears and listen, for the song of the spheres is dying down. Soon there will be nothing but silence. You must treasure every moment, every precious, fleeting moment. For time waits for no man, time marches ever forward, and each passing hour is like an arrow shot from a mighty bow. It passes swiftly from the quiver of the gods, and returns not. So go now, my friends, and take with you the lessons that you have learned here. Go forth, and be bold, but also be wise. Be honorable, be just, be temperate, be true. Love those who love you, forgive those who have wronged you, and do not be afraid to die. For when your time comes, you will be ready. When your number is called, you will have no regrets. You will have no fear. You will have learned to live. So ends our tale. So ends our history. So ends our story. There is nothing left to say, nothing more to do. Let the curtain fall. Let the trumpets fall silent. Let the drums be stilled. Let the lyre be laid aside. Let the banquet be cleared away. Let the feast be finished. The wine is spent. The guests are gone. The host is fallen. The tables are empty. The halls are silent. The palace is abandoned. The city is in ruins. The countryside is desolate. The fields are overgrown. The hills are bare. The sky is dark. The clouds are gathering. A cold wind blows over the hills. A lone wolf cries in the distance. Lightning flashes across the sky. Thunder rumbles in the hills. The rain begins to fall. The waves crash on the shore. And over all of it, over all of this, over the ruins of Rome, over the bones of Pompey, over the dust of Caesar, over the hearts of men, a great silence falls. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel to get notified when I release new videos.